Lake Argyll, in the far north of Western Australia, is one of the biggest man-made stretches of fresh water in Australia. The lake was formed by the damming of the Ord River, and it was an engineering project that wrote the final chapter in one of the nation's greatest pioneering stories. The rising waters of the lake submerged the famous Argyll Downs station, once home to the Durack family. However, before the waters rose, the old station homestead was moved from its original site and re-established as a state museum, recalling the exploits of the Duracks. The federal and West Australian governments combined to save the homestead in a project that cost almost $170,000. It took 3 years to move the building to its new site. Recently, 4 members of the Durack family returned to the country they helped to tame to attend the opening of the Homestead Museum. Among them was Dame Mary Durack, who has told the Argyll Downs story in her book, Kings in Grass Castles. As Brendan Wood reports, the occasion was a time for remembering the achievements of the pioneers.
For the Durack family, the return to Argyll was like a journey into the past. Argyll Downs Station holds a special place in the history of Western Australia. It was first settled in the 1880s by Patsy Durack after an epic across-the-nation cattle drive that took almost 3 years to complete. The station became the social centre of the Kimberley region. The Old Homestead Museum is about 16 kilometres from its original site, moved stone by stone from the path of one of Australia's biggest man-made lakes. The Ord River was for centuries a river of contrast. Almost dry for much of the year, it became a raging torrent after the annual cyclonic rains. At its peak, it flowed at a rate of 45,000 cubic metres a second. That's enough to fill Sydney Harbour in half an hour. It had a power generating capacity equal to 3 times all the nation's electricity schemes combined. And all this water poured wastefully into the Timor Sea. That changed a decade ago. A small dam was built and the 2,000 square kilometre Lake Argyll was formed. For historic Argyll Downs Station, it meant a watery grave. All but the main homestead now lies beneath the water. For 2 of the best-known members of the Durack family, the reunion had a special significance. Author Dame Mary and artist Elizabeth were together in the Kimberleys for the first time in more than 30 years. But the Kimberley they saw this time was dramatically different to the country of their youth.
The part that's gone under the water, of course, I don't dwell on what's gone under. It's no good doing that. It's futile. But I must say that it's created a new beauty. It's a new wonder has been created in that lake.
Is it a very sad thing to come back and see it now, having changed so much?
Yes, I could allow myself to be sad about it, but it's no good doing that. I think I feel fatalistic about it like the Aborigines themselves do. The inevitable.
The stations were an impersonal place to a large degree, and most of the big properties in the Kimberleys were controlled by overseas interests. By after the First World War, any small men had already gone to the wall, and the surviving ones were the bigger places, Sylvestres and Bovril and Manuel's, and ours was just big enough not to completely fold up, and yet not big enough to be enormously wealthy or have interests in other countries. And we certainly did have the closest family attachment to a large block of land in the Kimberleys, but it was always an investment proposition. That was the idea of it, more than the home.
For the two sisters, perhaps the most enjoyable part of the return was in the renewing of old friendships, particularly with the Aboriginal community, with whom they'd been so close for almost a lifetime. It was this closeness with the Aboriginal people that led Dame Mary and Elizabeth to collaborate on many children's books on the Aboriginal law and the Dreamtime. They perhaps have a greater knowledge of the Aboriginal ways than any other white women in Australia.
With all the fish on your shoulders,
Yeah.
remember that?
Yeah.
And it's too hot and we can't cook them all. A lot of them go bad before we can eat them, you remember?
Yeah.
So many fish, too many barramundi.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Do you remember that time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big.
Before the dam went in, we had long talks about the country and the spirit ancestors and the legends that were going with it, and I have put them down. Daylight is the oldest living one associated with the stockwork on Argyll and with the family, and he was given charge, as in the Aboriginal way, of a lot of the law, a lot of the local law, and was the last holder of a great many sacred objects that went under with the dam. And when I went around with Daylight just before the country went under the water, he was talking to me about it, and I said, well, you do know it's going? He said, yes, I know. And he indicated to me that he had in some way buried them in the country because they belong to the country, and he said, you can't take them away from the country where they belong. They'll always belong there.
For Dame Mary Durack, there is also a note of tragedy in the new lifestyle of the Kimberley Aborigines. The changes from the old ways have brought with them problems which many have found almost impossible to handle. But for Dame Mary, the changes and the associated problems were inevitable.
I know that they were inevitable, and many things would have had to change. Some of the changes came much too quickly, like the introduction of basic wage was a sad thing because it came very quickly, and stations that had employed from 50 to 100 Aboriginals, and they had been there in family groups, found themselves really unable to pay everybody basic wage, so that in the end they were only keeping a very limited amount, just the ones who could compete with the white stockmen, and the rest had to go. And then inevitably that split up the families, and many of the stockmen themselves got restless because their families weren't with them. They loved their families. And the drinking rights, we could never have gone on having one law for the blacks and one for the whites in this country. They had to have their rights. That meant their citizenship rights, and the drinking rights went with it, and that they would in time just have to learn to cope with them. Because as far as much of the country was concerned, the drink problem, it was not being coped with. It was only underground. It had been kicked under the carpet. They were drinking in the camps and in the bush, and it also opened the door to a great deal of racketeering on the part of the whites. It's only a short time we're dealing with, and it's hit them very suddenly and very hard. A couple of decades is nothing. I do find that many of them now say to me, we know it's our problem, and we know that only we can cope with it.
The name Durack will always be associated with the Kimberley region of Australia. But the family's physical ties with the country came to an end in the early 1950s when the Durack properties were sold off. For the present generation, the decision to pull out was a heavy blow.
Yes, I was terribly upset about the sale of the properties. We all were, because the whole family, there were 6 of us, you see, and my father was a very old man by this time. He'd always had the idea of dying a rich man, and it was a sort of a, what you might call a role model he had of himself, and probably got it from his own father, that you must do good, do well with your property and then sell it, and then you become a rich man and you dispense your wealth. That seemed to have been a concept that existed in Australia very strongly. So that by the time he was 80, it had become almost obsessional for him to sell these properties. That's all he wanted to do. There was no need to. There'd been a great period of involvement and debts and financial problems, but he'd got out of that. The cattle were just on the lift because it was post-war by this time, and in the face of the opposition of the whole 6 of us, he was insistent on selling the places. And I'm not saying anything against my father. Everyone lives within their own times, and we were terribly devoted to him. You know, we loved him dearly. But it was an extraordinary thing for a father to do in the face of opposition, you see, because we were terribly involved in the country. There's no doubt about it. I've been half hedging when you've been saying you're wrapped up in the country. We were too wrapped up in it. In fact, I think that worried our father even, that we'd got involved in a thing that should have been a commercial enterprise, you see, but we'd started to get emotionally tied up with it.
The kings in grass castles are no more. Lake Argyll now lies where one of Australia's biggest cattle empires once stretched. But while the water can cover the land, it cannot blot out the past. The Duracks will remain the dynasty of pioneers. Their story is like the story of Australia itself, a pioneering saga so huge in its concept that no amount of water could drown the memory.
In South Australia, filmmakers recreating a saga that draws on the history of another nation have been undertaking major reconstruction work in the interests of achieving maximum authenticity. This field gun is from World War I, but Australian cinemagoers will soon see it depicting British colonial firepower at the turn of the century. The South Australian Film Corporation had to compromise its commitment to history to obtain suitable props for its latest production, Breaker Morant. The film is set entirely in South Africa, but there are very few relics in Australia of the Boer War. The only solution was to borrow 2 field guns from the Unley Memorial Gardens in Adelaide.
All the other, we really had to shut the stove.
David Copping is the art director on Breaker Morant, and it's his job to make people believe what they see. He must bring alive visually a chapter of South African history that was written almost 80 years ago. It's a task that David Copping tackles with relish. Weekend magazine reporter Grant Heading takes up the story.
Australia's burgeoning film industry has been slow to appreciate the value of the art director. His creative talents are now being recognised as second only to those of the cameraman. Having devoted the past 10 years to improving the status of the art director, David Copping works tirelessly at proving he's the best in the land. Period films like Breaker Morant present the greatest challenge to an art department. It took nearly 8 months to collect memorabilia that would help create authentic film settings.
Thank you very much, sir.
David Copping is a freelance art director based in Sydney, but on this assignment he assembled a team of 7 assistants in Adelaide. Photographs taken on the Boer War battlefields gave a valuable guide to the arms and accoutrements that had to be collected or made.
Character stuff always stays in the vehicle. Right, okay.
Breaker Morant was an irrepressible Australian soldier serving in the Bushveld Carbineers, a British unit which conducted commando-style raids against the Boers. The film reenacts his trial and execution for murder.
We have lunch down there?
Art departments in Australia are handicapped by a lack of suitable properties to dress film sets. In Europe and the United States, filmmakers have access to huge barns of props for every conceivable setting. David Copping's buyers instead must scour and